In the summer of 2015, Elizabeth Holmes was the most celebrated entrepreneur in America. She was 31 years old. She was worth, on paper, $9 billion. She had appeared on the cover of Fortune, Forbes, and Time magazine in the same year. She gave TED Talks. She spoke at the United Nations. She was compared in print to Steve Jobs and Thomas Edison. The company she had founded at 19 years old was considered one of the most important medical breakthroughs in a generation. The technology she had built was going to change medicine forever. A single drop of blood from a finger prick, not a needle, just a tiny pinch, could be analyzed for hundreds of diseases simultaneously. Cancer, diabetes, heart disease, detected early, detected cheaply, detected in minutes, at a pharmacy, by anyone. She called the machine the Edison. There was only one problem. It didn't work. It had never worked, and Elizabeth Holmes had known that for years. This is the story of how one woman convinced the most powerful people in America to believe in something that didn't exist, built a company worth $9 billion on a foundation of pure fiction, and put the lives of real patients at risk in the process. It is a story about ambition, deception, and the specific blindness that money and charisma can produce in otherwise intelligent people. And it is a story about what happens when nobody in the room is willing to ask the one question that matters. Elizabeth Holmes enrolled at Stanford University in 2002 to study chemical engineering. In her second year, she approached a professor with an idea, a device that could monitor a patient's blood in real time and adjust medication automatically. The professor was struck by her, not just by the idea, but by the certainty with which she held it. In 2003, at 19 years old, Holmes dropped out of Stanford. She took her tuition money and founded a company. She called it Theranos, a combination of therapy and diagnosis. The vision was genuine in the beginning. The problem she had identified was real. Blood testing in America was expensive, inconvenient, and often required more blood than patients could comfortably give. A simpler, cheaper, faster method of testing could genuinely transform healthcare. It could save lives. It could democratize medicine in a way that nothing before it had managed to do. The vision was real. The technology to achieve it was not. From the earliest days of Theranos, the engineers and scientists Holmes hired encountered the same fundamental problem. The Edison machine could not do what Holmes was promising it could do. Blood is complex. Analyzing it accurately requires significant volumes and sophisticated equipment. The physics of working with a single finger prick sample, with the precision that medical diagnostics require, presented obstacles that Holmes's team could not overcome. Test results were inconsistent. Accuracy was unreliable. The machine that was supposed to run hundreds of tests from one drop of blood could only reliably run a handful, and even those results were often wrong. Scientists raised concerns. Engineers flagged problems. Some left. Some were pushed out. A culture of secrecy descended on Theranos unlike anything most employees had encountered before. Staff were forbidden from discussing their work across departments. Non-disclosure agreements were so broad that speaking to a lawyer about them potentially violated the agreements themselves. People who asked too many questions found themselves sidelined or dismissed. Holmes responded to every technological failure the way she responded to every obstacle, not by scaling back the promise, but by doubling down on it. The technology would catch up. It always did. The gap between what she was promising and what her machines could actually deliver was, in her mind, a temporary condition. But she was already selling it, as if the gap didn't exist. Holmes had a gift that had nothing to do with science. She was magnetic in a room. She spoke with a directness and calm authority that made people feel they were in the presence of someone who understood something fundamental that others had missed. She wore black turtlenecks, a deliberate echo of Steve Jobs, whose biography she had studied with care. Her voice was unusually deep, a register she had consciously cultivated, believing correctly that people took deeper voices more seriously. The investors came. Rupert Murdoch invested $125 million. The DeVos family, the Waltons, the Cox family, poured hundreds of millions in. Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle, invested. In total, Theranos raised more than $900 million from some of the wealthiest people in America. Almost none of them had any background in medical technology. Almost none of them had asked a scientist to review the underlying claims. They had sat across from Elizabeth Holmes, heard her describe a revolution in healthcare, and believed her. Her board of directors was extraordinary, not for its scientific expertise, but for the complete absence of it. Henry Kissinger sat on the board. George Shultz, the former Secretary of State. James Mattis, the retired four-star general, who would later become Secretary of Defense. Senators, admirals, the most decorated figures in American public life. Not one of them was a scientist. Not one had the technical background to ask whether the Edison machine worked. And nobody was asking. In 2013, Theranos signed a partnership with Walgreens. Theranos wellness centers opened inside stores across Arizona. Patients walked in, gave a drop of blood, and received results their doctors used to make medical decisions. The tests were not being run on the Edison machine. Theranos was quietly running most samples on standard commercial analyzers made by companies like Siemens, equipment used by any ordinary laboratory, and then applying its own modifications to stretch the results to smaller sample sizes than the machines were designed to handle. The proprietary technology at the center of everything was barely being used. Patients received inaccurate results. Some were told they might have cancer when they did not. Some adjusted their medication doses based on information that was wrong. Some made significant, frightening, life-altering medical decisions based on data produced by a system Elizabeth Holmes knew was unreliable. She knew. The internal reports existed. The failed quality control records existed. The emails in which scientists raised alarms existed. And she continued. The unraveling began with a reporter named John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal. In 2015, Carreyrou received a tip. Vague at first, just a suggestion that something at Theranos was not what it appeared. He began making calls. He began finding former employees, scientists, and engineers bound by non-disclosure agreements, but troubled enough by what they had seen to speak carefully in ways that pointed him toward the truth. The first person to speak on record was a young man named Tyler Shultz. He was 22 years old. He was also the grandson of George Shultz, the former Secretary of State sitting on the Theranos board. Tyler had joined Theranos out of genuine belief in its mission. What he found inside the company horrified him. He had flagged the accuracy problems internally. He had been dismissed. He had gone to his grandfather and told him what he had seen. George Shultz had believed Holmes over his own grandson. Tyler contacted regulators. He spoke to Carreyrou. Holmes responded by unleashing Theranos' legal team on him. He was followed. His phone records were subpoenaed. He spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, defending himself against a company whose stated mission was the benefit of patients. He was 22 years old. He didn't stop. Carreyrou's first story ran in October 2015. Holmes went on television immediately, dismissing the reporting as the work of someone who didn't understand science. Her board stood behind her. Her investors stood behind her. But the regulators were already moving. Federal investigators examined the Theranos laboratory in California. What they found was damning. Deficient laboratory practices, unreliable test results, equipment used in ways it was never certified for. In 2016, federal regulators banned Holmes from operating medical laboratories and moved to revoke Theranos' laboratory certification entirely. Walgreens terminated its partnership. The investors who had poured $900 million into the company began to understand what they had purchased. The valuation of $9 billion collapsed to nothing. In June 2018, the Department of Justice indicted Elizabeth Holmes on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. The charges alleged that she had deliberately deceived investors, doctors, and patients over more than a decade. Her trial began in 2021. Her defense was that she had genuinely believed in what she was building, that the gap between her promises and her technology was the gap of an optimist, not a fraudster, that she had been controlled and misled by her business partner and romantic partner, Ramesh Balwani. The jury convicted her on 4 counts of fraud against investors. In November 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She reported to prison in May 2023. What Theranos left behind was more than a failed company and a criminal conviction. It left a question the business world is still working through. How did $900 million flow into a company that so many insiders knew was built on fiction? How did the most celebrated board in Silicon Valley history sit in meetings for years without asking for independent scientific verification of the technology at the center of everything? How did a regulatory system designed to protect patients allow unvalidated medical tests to be run on hundreds of thousands of people? Part of the answer is Holmes herself. Her ability to create a reality around her, powerful enough to override the instincts of people who should have known better. Part of the answer is a culture that had built a theology around visionary founders, that demanding proof was a failure of imagination, not a reasonable request. And part of the answer is the same pattern that appears again and again in every catastrophic failure. The people who knew were silenced by contracts, by lawyers, by a culture of fear so complete that raising a concern felt like career destruction, by the gravitational force of a narrative that powerful people had already invested in and did not want disturbed. Tyler Schultz stood outside a building in San Francisco, calling a lawyer from a burner phone because he was afraid Theranos was monitoring his regular line, trying to understand how to tell the truth without destroying himself in the process. He was 22 years old. The difference between the fraud continuing and the fraud ending was one person willing to say, at enormous personal cost, that what he had seen was wrong. The Edison machine never worked. It never detected cancer from a single drop of blood. It never democratized medicine. It never did anything it promised to do. For more than a decade, one of the most celebrated companies in America existed entirely in the space between what Elizabeth Holmes said and what was true. And the real cost of that space was not measured in dollars or valuations or the ruins of a Silicon Valley legend. It was measured in the patients who trusted those results, who made decisions, who were frightened when they didn't need to be, or reassured when they should have been alarmed. People who handed a drop of blood to a machine and trusted that what came back was real. It wasn't. And somewhere between the vision and the truth, between the magazine covers and the federal courtroom, between $9 billion and 11 years in prison. That is where the Theranos story actually lives. Not in the ambition, in the cost of believing it, without ever stopping to ask whether any of it was real.